Welcome back to Sleepy Chronicles. Tonight, we're asking how you could have actually survived the Black Death and what the answer says about the rest of us. We begin with the first and heaviest decision of 1348, where to stand. Lie back and get comfortable. If you enjoy quiet voices and slow history, take a moment to like and subscribe. It costs nothing and means a lot. Let us know where you're listening from tonight. We'll take it from here. There is a version of 1348 where staying put felt like the reasonable choice. It was also, statistically, the worst one. Osbert Fenn was 17, a wool merchant's apprentice with ink ground permanently into the creases of his right hand, a stain that never scrubbed out. That hand was steady on a ledger and useless with a sword, which suited him fine. London that autumn needed people who could lie low and notice when a room had gone quiet in the wrong way. His father set something beside the candle one evening, a fresh ledger, pages blank, spine still stiff. "Keep this close," he said. "Every merchant needs a record of what he owns." Osbert had no idea it would take years to fill a single page, and that the reason would have nothing to do with wool. Picture the city around him. Narrow lanes stacked 3 stories high, timber leaning toward timber until the sky became a thin gray ribbon. Not exaggeration, just Tuesday. What almost nobody understood was that density itself was the danger. Not sin, not stars. Simply too many bodies breathing the same narrow air, buying bread from the same 3 stalls because there were only 3. A flea didn't need to travel far, just a few feet, one warm sleeve to the next. We'd call a place like that walkable today and pay extra rent for the privilege. Osbert's master kept the shop open through October, insisting the sickness was a rumor. Osbert believed him for 9 days, until a family 2 doors down stopped answering their door. Imagine standing at that counting table, listening for a knock that never came, understanding slowly what the silence meant. Surviving the Black Death rewarded people willing to seem rude, to let a knock go unanswered. Osbert packed the ledger, a spare shirt, nothing else, and walked out the city gate before sunrise, past a toll collector too busy coughing to charge him. A city built for trade, emptied by the very thing that made it valuable. 12 miles north and higher up, a different kind of quiet was already working in someone else's favor. Brother Aldhun had not spoken a full sentence aloud in 11 years and intended to keep it that way. His hands, once soft as any merchant's son, had gone rough from cold stone and colder water. He belonged to a small Carthusian house, an order built around silence long before anyone in it had reason to fear a crowd. What looked like devotion from the outside was, from the inside, mostly distance with better lighting. Imagine the walk up to that gate, loose stone underfoot, breath showing at midday. No other traveler in sight for the better part of an hour. A silence, once merely spiritual now, felt like a wall. Elevation did something the monks never planned for. A rat needs shelter from the cold and grain worth stealing. A windswept hillside monastery, storing exactly enough for a handful of silent men, offered neither in any real quantity. By pure accident, this was one of the safer addresses in England. Aldhun's days ran on a rhythm so fixed it barely needed thought. Prayer, bred from grain the house grew itself, silence, sleep. No markets, no shared cups, no travelers arriving with news and company riding in their sleeves. Virtue didn't protect these men. Distance did, dressed up as holiness. Not every monk stayed behind the gate. A few, softer-hearted and worse-timed, walked down into the sick towns to nurse strangers. Aldhun watched 2 leave that autumn and never return. He wrote their names on a scrap of vellum, tucked under a loose stone by his cot. A door that stayed shut outlived a door that opened out of kindness. We treat a retreat into silence today as a luxury, a weekend with no signal, something we pay for and photograph. In 1348, that same absence of noise was simply how a person survived until Thursday. It just worked on a hillside that never once tried to be impressive. Down in the valley, the choice was rarely dramatic. People noticed who was still answering their door and who had already stopped. The ones who noticed early tended to still be alive by spring. That, more than any doctor or prayer, is where survival began. Looking wealthy in 1348 meant, in a very literal sense, inviting guests you did not want. Mabel Thorncroft had spent 11 years with a needle between her fingers, and her hands showed it. A permanent map of small white scars across both thumbs. She ran the only decent tailoring stall in her end of the market, and by that autumn, she'd started giving advice nobody asked for. A wool merchant's wife came to her that October wanting a heavy overcoat, fox trim at the collar, 3 layers beneath. Mabel measured the fabric in silence, running a thumb along the fur where it would sit thick against the throat, warm and dark, and undisturbed for hours at a stretch. A household standing could often be measured in how much fabric stood between its skin and the outside world, and every fold was a place a flea could wait, patient and unnoticed, for as long as it needed. A flea has far less to grip on a tight, plain weave than on thick, loose wool, which is why households that came through the worst of it tended to dress plainly. Linen over fur, close-fitted sleeves instead of billowing ones, hemlines cut short rather than trailing the ground. Mabel herself hadn't touched a fox collar in months, not out of fear exactly, more a growing suspicion that comfort and safety had quietly stopped being the same thing. Imagine coming into her stall that season asking, as most still did, for more fabric, more visible proof that you could afford it. Mabel would nod, take the measurements, and mention, almost as an afterthought, that linen was lighter this time of year. It rarely worked. Fashion moves slower than fear. We'd call this a maximalist era today. More texture and layering as a mark of status. In 1348, it meant more folds to disappear into, one sleeve at a time. Even an unworn coat, folded and left in a chest for a week, could still be carrying something that hadn't fed yet. Fleas are patient that way. Some households, out of instinct rather than understanding, took every stitch a sick relative had worn and set it alight in the yard. They didn't know why it seemed to help. It simply did. The best coat in the room was, more often than anyone wanted to admit, the most dangerous thing in it. Across town, in a low stone building that smelled permanently of ash and lye, Isolde Tanner kept doing something the era's most respected physicians had explicitly warned against. She washed. Isolde ran what remained of a public bathhouse, one of the last still open in a region where most had closed under suspicion. Her hands, submerged daily in hot water and harsh soap, had gone raw at the knuckles. Physicians of the age were certain that heat and steam pried the body's defenses open, leaving a person exposed to whatever sickness happened by. Isolde had heard the theory explained to her, as though she were a child. She kept working. What the physicians missed, and what Isolde noticed without naming it scientifically, was that dirt itself worked like a welcome mat. Fleas thrived on unwashed skin under weeks of the same clothing. A body washed even occasionally with whatever coarse soap could be boiled up at home was simply less inviting. Picture yourself walking past that bathhouse door on a cold morning, catching the smell of ash and lye instead of the usual street smell, and crossing to the other side without knowing why. Isolde noticed people doing exactly that. She kept scrubbing her arms with soap she'd made herself. Nobody had told her this was survival. It looked, to everyone outside, like recklessness. Soap was expensive when it wasn't homemade, and homemade soap smelled faintly of tallow. Not pleasant, but better than the alternative. Most households considered laundry finished the moment a garment had been scrubbed clean once, sometime in the past month. Isolde boiled hers weekly, a habit her neighbors found suspicious. What's easy to miss about Isolde is that she wasn't defying physicians because she understood germs. She had no framework for that. She kept washing because the alternative felt wrong, and because, this once, instinct outperformed the science. We treat a hot shower today as basic upkeep, barely worth mentioning. In 1348, that same act was medically discouraged by educated men with real credentials, and quietly practiced anyway by the people who lived. By the time the worst passed, Isolde's bathhouse was one of the few in the region still standing, still smelling of ash and lye instead of the silence over so many other doors. Clean hands outlasted expert opinion. What people wore and how often they washed it were never framed, at the time, as matters of life and death. Only manners, only what a household could show the street. But the body carries what it's given, and in 1348, that quiet daily choice mattered more than anyone judging it understood. The most respected men in London that winter killed about as reliably as the disease they claimed to be fighting. Master Hubert Pike had trained 9 years to become a physician, and every year taught him the same theory. The body carried 4 essential fluids, and illness was proof they had slipped out of their proper measure. His training told him what to do about it. Open a vein, draw off what didn't belong, and trust the body to right itself once the excess was gone. He carried a small folding case of lancets, and his fingertips had gone permanently pink at the nail beds from work. He no longer thought to notice. By November, Hubert covered his face before entering a sick room, not vanity, but because the smell had become something his stomach couldn't negotiate with. He packed the mask's beak with dried lavender and crushed clove, less medicine than mercy, mostly for himself. He never touched a patient with his bare hand if he could help it. A long wooden rod did most of the work, prodding at swellings, lifting a blanket to check for dark patches at throat and groin. Distance, even he understood, felt safer than closeness. Imagine sitting in one of those sick rooms, feverish, watching a man in a leather beak lean over you with a blade instead of a kind word, and being grateful he'd come at all. Here's the part that took Hubert longest to admit. The households that sent him away, who kept their sick relative warm, gave them water, changed the linens, and waited, seemed to lose fewer people than the ones who paid for his visits. He noticed it first with a baker's family on Fish Street, then again near the bridge. He had no word for why, only a growing suspicion that his presence in a room did not help nearly as much as his fee suggested. We check star ratings today before letting anyone near us with a blade. In 1349, the only credential anyone verified was the size of a man's hat and the confidence in his voice. And confidence, it turned out, cured almost nothing. Hubert kept working anyway, because the alternative was watching people die, with no one in the room who claimed to understand why. And because, in a city this frightened, someone confident always beats someone honest. A man who bled his patients for a living learned, slowly and too late, that the safest visit was the one he never made. Across the river, in work nobody discussed at supper, Watt Sconce had found something close to job security. Watt dug graves. His hands, wrapped permanently in thick leather even in warm weather, had gone hard and scarred across the knuckles from years of shovel handles and cold earth. He worked alone, arriving before dawn and finishing before the streets filled. Every morning, before touching a tool, he checked his own body in the reflection of a water barrel behind his shed. Throat first, then under each arm, a private ritual nobody had taught him. The most dangerous work that year belonged to anyone whose job required leaving. A royal messenger might cover 30 miles between sunrise and dusk, stopping in a dozen households to deliver a single folded letter. never staying long enough to notice who inside had gone quiet. Merchants covered less ground, but far more thoroughly, carrying wool and pepper from port to market. And without intending to, whatever had climbed aboard along the road, Watt's own trade, by contrast, kept him almost entirely alone. He touched the dead, yes, but the dead don't sneeze or lean in close to speak. His real protection wasn't the gloves. It was the empty space his job had built around him without anyone intending it. Picture yourself as a customer that winter, knocking at a familiar door, hearing footsteps that never came closer, and understanding exactly why. We treat working from home today as a hard-won lifestyle perk, something people negotiate for. In 1349, staying inside one's own workshop, one's own quiet corner of a trade, was simply how a person avoided becoming someone else's story. A miller stayed by his own wheel. A blacksmith stayed by his own forge. Add every baker minding a single oven, and an entire class of trade existed that required almost no travel and almost no strangers, just fire, flour, and the same four walls, day after day. A cobbler near Watt Street took to leaving finished shoes outside his door rather than opening it, a habit his neighbors found rude until it very obviously wasn't. Nobody planned for solitude to become a survival strategy. The quietest trades in the city simply turned out to be the safest ones. By spring, Watt had buried more neighbors than he could count, and outlived every doctor once paid more in a week than he earned in a season. What kept a person alive that year rarely looked like skill or wisdom. More often, it looked like a job nobody envied, done quietly by someone who'd learned to stay out of everyone's way. The thing that made Marguerite Fenwick least welcome at market that winter was very likely the same thing keeping her alive. Marguerite sold herbs from a corner stall she'd kept for 20 years. By November, her hands smelled permanently of garlic, worked so deep into her palms that soap couldn't touch it. She strung bulbs over her doorway and ate more of it raw than any physician would have recommended. Nobody could explain why garlic seemed to matter. The prevailing belief held that foul air carried sickness, so anything sharp enough to cut the stench counted as medicine. It's tempting to laugh at the logic now, harder to laugh at the fact it may have quietly worked. Marguerite didn't know about fleas or the antibacterial properties chemists would later measure in a clove. She only knew the smell drove people from her stall, and that felt like an advantage. Picture standing near her that November, eyes watering from the cloves in her sleeve, understanding, without quite knowing why, that you'd rather stand there than anywhere crowded. It didn't make her untouchable. Marguerite buried a niece that winter, a girl who wore garlic same as everyone, but had spent her last healthy week nursing a sick neighbor. Garlic was never a wall, only a small brick in a larger one. We treat garlic today as a wellness trend. Capsules sold at a premium for benefits nobody can quite name. In 1348, it was cheap and ordinary, and entirely by accident, one of the few remedies that wasn't making anyone worse. A woman too unpleasant to stand near outlived most of the people who complained about her. Across town, a very different kind of ritual was gathering in the market square, one with far worse instincts. When an explanation runs out, someone always becomes the explanation. That autumn, the someone was Peter Wexler, a dyer whose hands had gone permanently blue from woad and madder root. A well near the tanning district went foul, and within a day, half the street decided his stained hands meant poison, not trade. Imagine hearing a crowd gather outside your own door, growing louder, certain of something untrue, and realizing calm explanations are no longer an option anyone is offering you. Peter escaped through a back lane before the crowd reached his workshop, and spent 9 days in a miller's grain loft 2 villages over. The mob, having lost its target, moved on to a beekeeper nearby, overheard muttering to himself all summer, and burned his hives instead. Here's what almost nobody in that crowd noticed. A dozen frightened people, shoulder to shoulder, sharing breath in a tight circle, spread the sickness faster than Peter's dye-stained hands ever could have. The mob wasn't hunting the plague. It was feeding it. We call it a pylon today. Strangers gathering online to burn someone in effigy over a rumor nobody checked. The torches have changed. The instinct to find a face for an invisible fear hasn't moved an inch. Peter never returned to his workshop until spring, and never learned the well's actual cause. A door 2 streets over stayed a great deal quieter, and a great deal safer for it. Joan Kestrel had no interest in mobs, cloves, or missing wells. Her war was smaller and far more literal. It was fought entirely in her own pantry. Joan's hands, roughened from hauling clay jars and climbing a step stool to the rafters, had spent the year moving grain further off the ground. A sack left on the floor was an invitation nobody needed to send twice. She hung baskets from the ceiling, sealed what she could in fired clay, and kept 3 cats prowling the kitchen, more useful than any physician in the city. Rats themselves weren't the sickness. Their fleas were, and fleas needed something to ride. Cut off the rats, and the fleas had a harder journey. Joan didn't know the mechanism, only that households still finding chewed sacks in their flour seemed to lose people that winter. Imagine checking your own pantry by candlelight, the way Joan did most nights, running a hand along the shelf edge for the gritty trail that meant something had gotten in again. It looked like paranoia. It was closer to a strategy nobody had bothered to name. In villages where frightened neighbors killed cats as suspected witches' familiars, the superstition meant to ward off evil cleared the way for the vermin it feared. Joan kept hers close and said nothing about it. We treat a well-organized pantry today as a small domestic pleasure, jars labeled, worth a photograph. In 1348, that same tidiness was closer to armor, built one shelf at a time by someone tired of losing a fight she couldn't see. By spring, Joan's household had lost no one. She never thought of herself as having fought the plague, only as someone who'd finally gotten the mice under control, which amounted to nearly the same thing. None of it the garlic, the burned houses, the elevated grain, came from understanding what was actually happening. It came from fear finding somewhere to go, sometimes uselessly, sometimes with real teeth, rarely landing close to the truth of what it was trying to fight. 6 years is a long time to leave a book empty. Osbert Fenn had gone back to London the spring after the worst of it passed, taken up the wool trade again, and grown, slowly, and without quite noticing, into the kind of steady, unremarkable merchant his father had once been. He still had the ledger. It sat on the same shelf it always had, spine no longer stiff, pages still blank. A small, quiet fact he'd stopped thinking about most days. Think about the last time you did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. The last time care and outcome simply refused to line up. Osbert never found the arithmetic that explained why he'd lived. What he never fully worked out in all his years of tallying wool and coin was why he'd lived at all. He'd done everything right by his own reckoning. Left early, kept to himself, avoided crowds, stayed clean. But he'd known a carter that same year who did none of it, drank from shared cups, slept in crowded rooms, laughed off every warning, and walked out the other side without so much as a fever. He'd also buried a cousin who'd done everything correctly and still didn't make it to Christmas. We now know a little of what Osbert couldn't. Some people carry small differences in their blood, inherited and invisible, that made them harder for the sickness to take hold of. Nobody in 1348 could have measured this. It simply meant that among equally careful people, equally frightened people, some walked away and some didn't, for reasons no ledger could account for. We spend a great deal today chasing the idea that enough discipline, enough supplements, enough optimizing can put the outcome fully in our hands. Osbert would have understood the impulse and quietly disagreed with it. Care mattered. It just wasn't the whole story, and he'd buried enough careful people to know it. He never resented the not knowing. He simply carried it, the way a merchant carries a debt nobody can collect. 12 miles north, behind a gate that had stayed shut for the worst of it. A very different kind of accounting was finally taking place. Brother Aldhun had kept his silence through the sickness, and for some years after, but by the time gray had reached his beard, something in him had loosened enough to write properly. Once, years earlier, he'd managed only 2 names on a scrap of vellum, tucked under a loose stone by his cot. Now he kept a running account and had stopped hiding it. The people who left the clearest record of that whole terrible stretch were rarely the ones who'd done anything dramatic. More often, they were the ones who'd simply survived long enough and stayed still long enough to notice what had happened and set it down. Aldhun kept his register in the margins of the monastery's account book, a line here and there among the grain tallies and rents. Who in the valley had died, who hadn't, who had vanished from a house that never opened its door again. Picture him at that desk on a winter evening, breath fogging as it always had, dipping a pen he'd barely touched in a decade, writing a stranger's name for no reason, except that someone, eventually, should know it had been true. He never intended the register to be read. He kept it anyway, the way a person keeps a promise nobody asked them to make. We document everything today, every meal, every thought, before it's even finished happening. In 1348, writing anything down at all was rare enough to be its own small act of faith, reserved for whoever survived long enough to have something left to say. A monk who'd sworn off nearly every kind of speech found, in the end, one worth keeping. Some years after Aldhun began his Fuller Register, a wool shipment brought Osbert north on business, close enough to the old hill road that he found himself, almost without deciding to, climbing it. The monastery gate was the same. The silence was the same. Aldhun, older now and willing to speak a little more than he once had, didn't recognize the merchant at first. Only the ledger tucked under his arm, still mostly blank. Osbert hadn't brought it to show anyone. He'd simply carried it out of habit, the way some people carry a key to a door they no longer live behind. That evening, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself, he finally opened it, dipped a pen, and wrote a single line, not a tally of wool or coin, but a plain sentence about a city he'd left before dawn one October, and a hillside that had somehow, without ever meaning to, kept two strangers alive long enough to meet again. We call people who survived difficult things brave, as though survival were a decision made bravely in the moment. Most of it, for Osbert and Aldhun both, and for nearly everyone who made it through that year, was quieter than that. It was where you chose to stand, what you let near your body, who you let near your life. Small, unglamorous choices repeated daily by people who mostly just wanted to keep being ordinary a little longer. If you've made it this far, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and let the room around you go soft and unfocused. There's nothing left to track tonight. No ledgers, no doors, no distance to measure. Just the quiet and the simple, uneventful luck of being here for it. If this kind of slow history helps you rest, consider leaving a like or subscribing before you drift off. It costs nothing and helps this little corner of the internet keep going. Sleep well, wherever you're listening from tonight.